Hello and welcome to the New Hope online sermon for January the 9th, 2022. We're glad that you're here. I'm glad that you're here. You may be watching this at home because you can't get out right now. You may be on the road. You may live somewhere besides South Central Indiana, and this is the only way you can be part of New Hope. But we're glad you're here. If COVID is keeping you away, we're not going to get judgy on that. I know several people that last Sunday and then again this Sunday are saying we just can't risk it. It looks like things are going to get worse before they get better. Maybe after they get better, end of January, mid-February, into March, sometime there, maybe the virus will have beat itself up. We just hope that you're safe when we get to a safer spot, or you're healthy when we get to a safer spot. And if you need to stay home, we certainly encourage you to. Probably be helpful for our medical people too, if we try to slow things down a little bit. So we're not going to judge you on that, but again, glad that you are here. Last week I started off the preaching year reminding us that there's plenty of suffering to go around. It wasn't a very optimistic sermon, but I didn't want it to be. Suffering can be especially intense during the holidays. I read from Jeremiah, the prophet of long ago, who knew a thing or two about trouble. His public ministry consisted largely of delivering the hard word that Jerusalem was about to be destroyed by Babylon. But the section of Jeremiah that I preached from last week was one of the more hopeful parts of his message, when he looks out through and beyond the approaching crisis to see a future moment years out when God would rescue a remnant of Israel and bring them back to Jerusalem. So something to live for there. But today I want to read a more typical passage from Jeremiah, one that is much less hopeful. It's all mourning, M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, and tears here. Jeremiah 8, beginning with verse 18. You who are my comforter in sorrow, my heart is faint within me. Listen to the cry of my people from a land far away. Is the Lord not in Zion? Is her king no longer there? Why have they aroused my anger with their images, with their worthless foreign idols? The harvest is past, the summer has ended, and we are not saved. Since my people are crushed, I am crushed. I mourn, and horror grips me. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then is there no healing for the wound of my people? And in Hebrew text, verse 1 of the 9th chapter is included at the end of 8, so I'll include it here too. Oh, that my head were a spring of water, and my eyes a fountain of tears. I would weep day and night for the slain of my people. Word of the Lord. So my sermon today is a little bit complicated. It's going to help if you think of it, the sermon, as a triangle of scripture themes. And at one point is Jeremiah the prophet, and the text that I just read can represent that point. At another point is Jesus and Peter's confession of him in Matthew chapter 16. At another point is you and me and those many texts in the New Testament that suggests that the church will be a suffering people. So Jeremiah, the confession, Peter's confession of Jesus, and the suffering texts that are in the New Testament. I think I could actually start off at any one of those points and do the same sermon. And all week I went back and forth on where I would start, but I finally decided it'd be best to start with those frequent warnings in the New Testament saying that those of us who follow Jesus will face persecution, trouble, suffering. In Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7, Jesus lays out what will be the new conditions of God's reign, starting with the Beatitudes. Who are the blessed ones in God's kingdom? The poor, the sorrowful, the meek, those starved for justice, the merciful, the pure, peacemakers, and the persecuted. The series of blessings ends with this. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. The message on persecution there is twofold. First of all, the fact that those who follow Jesus will face their share of trouble. But second, those who take on suffering will be like the prophets of old and will be rewarded by God. Numerous other places in the New Testament confirm that we should expect suffering to be part of the Christian experience. In the Gospels, Jesus tells his disciples that to follow him will mean taking up their cross. And the cross, of course, was an instrument of torture, of suffering. Jesus tells his disciples that they will be hated by all because of his name, Matthew 10. Paul writes in Romans 3 that he is being put to death all day long, is considered as a sheep to be slaughtered. In his letter to the Philippians, chapter 3, Paul speaks of how he experiences the fellowship of Jesus' sufferings and is being conformed to his death. And in the same letter earlier, chapter 1, he says that believers are not only privileged to believe in him, to believe in Jesus, but also to suffer for him. And maybe the reality of Christian suffering is framed most powerfully in 2 Corinthians 4. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake. Now, there are, of course, some believers in the world who know persecution and suffering very well. Today, it is dangerous, and not just difficult, to be Christian in North Korea, China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, all across North Africa, and in many other places around the world. Thousands of believers are killed each year for their faith. And what about us? Well, because we know the New Testament promise of suffering, I think many American Christians look to define their own faith experience in terms of suffering, and what they usually come up with is some version of psychological discomfort or hurt feelings. As in, I was witnessing to a friend today, and you know what happened? They laughed in my face. Can you believe I had to carry that cross today? I think Christians from other times and places would have a hard time calling something like that persecution. Or I think more commonly in the American church, the New Testament promise of suffering is understood in terms of potential. If we aren't careful, we're going to face some trouble. We're going to face some suffering, and usually that's followed by political advice. And that may be true. Our day may come. But is Jesus' message of the cross only a warning about the future, something to look out for? What does it mean for those of us who have it pretty well to suffer for Christ? Well, I want to get to maybe an answer for that question through Jesus and Jeremiah. Now I will jump to the second point of the triangle. I want to go here to Matthew's account of Peter's confession of Jesus. That confession of Jesus also in Mark and Luke, and the moment of Peter's confession comes about roughly halfway through those Gospels. In Matthew, it is in chapter 16. Jesus has his followers gathered around him. He's working his way to the question, so now that you guys have watched me and heard my teachings, who do you think I am? And that's when Peter will answer, you are the Christ, the Son of God. But Jesus sets it up first by asking what his followers are hearing from other people. Who do people think that I am? Matthew 16:14. They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. What interests me about Matthew's account is this: his is the only report telling us that some people were thinking that Jesus' ministry might somehow be connected to the Old Testament work of Jeremiah. It's interesting. I mean, why Jeremiah? Who was Jeremiah? Well, I told you last week that Jeremiah prophesied the fall of Judah to the Babylonians and the destruction of the holy city, Jerusalem. And there's no darker point in the Old Testament. And Jeremiah was called by God to deliver the bad news. We're at the Jeremiah point of the triangle now, right? And Jeremiah seems to have cried his way through his task. Last verse I read, what is in our Bible, Jeremiah 9:1. Oh, that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears. I would weep day and night for the slain of my people. Jeremiah is often called the weeping prophet. We even invented a noun from his name. A Jeremiad is a woeful lament, as in, after her boyfriend broke up with her, her conversation with me was just one long Jeremiad. Turns out, Jeremiah's basic posture is rather unique when compared to most of the other Old Testament prophets. Most of them seem to keep a safe distance between themselves and the people that they judge. Maybe that's a way of preserving, preaching prophetic integrity. Don't get close to those people that you're going to need to reprimand. Perhaps stay far enough back so that you don't get blood spatters on your clothes. Anyway, most prophets tended to keep a little bit of a distance to do their work, but not Jeremiah. He locates himself with his judged people as a fellow sufferer. Consider verse 21 of our Jeremiah reading today. Since my people are crushed, I am crushed. I mourn, and horror grips me. In verse 22, there is no balm, there's no medicine, there's no chemo in Gilead for my people. No physician, no healing for their wound. No cure, But he, sobbing prophet that he is, will be at bedside holding the hands of his people. Almost hospice care. He will be with them, use his life to comfort whatever is left in theirs, will sing to them his Jeremiads. And Matthew has some people identifying Jesus with Jeremiah. Why in the world would they do that? Jesus, who leaves the glory of the heavenly realms to take on flesh and nerves and to walk in the dust and to experience hunger and pain. Jesus, whose name is Emmanuel, which means God with us. Jesus, who in this world of much alienation becomes an exile. Jesus, who takes a chair beside tax collectors and prostitutes, the judged and damned of the world. Jesus, who always seems to move toward the ill instead of away from them. Jesus, who cries real tears on his way to a friend's tomb. Jesus, who coming to Jerusalem at the end of his ministry, cries over his people and prays a very Jeremiah-like prayer. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. Or maybe we just apply Jeremiah's words to Jesus. Since my people are crushed, I am crushed. I mourn, and horror grips me. Jesus, who rides into Jerusalem, carrying in his heart the weight of the world. Jesus, who in that room of feasting sinners gets on the floor and washes feet. Jesus, who breaks bread, celebrates the Lord's Supper with a betrayer. Jesus, who joins the ranks of the world's tortured. Jesus, who even dies. So you're saying that people somehow saw Jesus as connected to Jeremiah the prophet, the Jeremiah traditions? Doesn't take a Rhodes Scholar to see why. Which now brings me back to the question of suffering, particularly Christian suffering. And I think there are, at the most basic level, two kinds of Christian suffering, two varieties of suffering. First, there is the suffering that may come simply by virtue of following Jesus, just having the status of Christian in a world that sometimes is hard on people who are called that. Call it the suffering that happens to us. And in the scope of Christian suffering through the ages, we honestly don't face too much of that, do we? And I would say we probably shouldn't go looking for it. Avoid it if you possibly can, obviously. But there is another kind of suffering that we dare not avoid, or else we're not very good followers of Jesus. And that is the suffering of the world that we voluntarily enter into and take upon ourselves. I just call it the suffering that we enter into, the suffering of others that we, by faith, happily share with them. If we escape the first kind of suffering, the outside assault of persecution, I think we should just give thanks to God. But if we somehow have managed to be insulated from the second kind, the suffering of a world that cries out to us, then what we must do is repent and make ourselves vulnerable again to it, to that suffering. Because when Jesus said, "Take up your cross and follow me," he was calling us to a life shaped like his, a life poured into suffering people in a world of suffering. It's a call to join Jesus in weeping for the world. Don't miss the fact that Jesus in his life and ministry consistently went toward suffering. He came into a broken world. He intentionally went to miserable places and sat with miserable people. And I think to be Christian is, in a sense, to be a reproduction of Emmanuel, God with the world. And then, in those places of misery, Jesus chose to carry burdens. Rather than naming the mistakes of people and holding them to the consequences of their failures, he lifted burdens off of them, even absorbed the sin of others, bearing it in his wounded body. And we are called to follow that pattern, each of us in our own way. And I'll just close with a question. How do you in your life bear the suffering of the world? Have a great week. More importantly, have a meaningful week.